Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and welcome back to another video of the Roanoke Valley Chess Club. And we're going to start the third series, or I guess fourth series on the channel, where we're going to be covering the classic games of the past, great games of the past. And we're going to start with a game that I think every player actually needs to have memorized. Simply because it teaches what to do in the opening, the very basics of what to do in the opening, the very basics of what not to do in the opening, has some great tactics, and has a good explanation of what to do when you have the initiative and when you have an advantage, as well as how to deal with a few specific situations. And this is, of course, the famous opera game between Paul Morphy with the white pieces and the Count and the Duke with the black pieces. Of course, this took place at an opera in Paris, if I remember correctly. And, of course, two players had the black pieces. It was a consultation for them. Morphy was just being Morphy. So let's go ahead and get this one started. E4, E5. This was basically the starting position for most of chess history. There had been positions that, there were other openings that were known. The French defense, Morphy played a few of those. Sicilians existed. But for the majority of chess history, it was E4, E5, and that was your starting position. Of course, queen pawn openings did exist, specifically closed game, various queens gambits, that sort of thing. Anyway, Morphy played this move, which is still mainline today, and instead of the best move, which is of course knight c6, the Count and Duke played the Philidor defense, which of course is named after the very famous player who was at the time, who most people would consider the best player of his era. Philidor, I forget his first name, but I think it's French, something French. And his whole thing is pawns are the soul of chess. And the idea is we're going to create and solidify and defend this pawn on e5 by just defending it with a pawn, quite simply, because it's under attack. But it fails to put extra pressure on this central square d4, which is why nowadays, in addition to also blocking development of the dark squared bishop, which is one of the reasons why nowadays no one really plays the Philidor, and instead everybody plays knight c6, or at least most people play knight c6. You will occasionally see people play the Philidor with a Peart's move order. So starting with one d6, knight f6, and then playing e5. But anyway, the Philidor was the move chosen by the Count and the Duke, and as you can see, d4 was played. And already here we have a slight inaccuracy. f5 is a move, bishop here is a move if I remember correctly. Knight d7, knight c6 are both moves. And the idea is that actually white is sort of threatening to win a pawn here. And the Count and the Duke don't actually stop this with their move of bishop g4. And I'll go ahead and give you a little bit of, I'll give you about 5 seconds to figure out how white can win a pawn here. Alright, if you guessed pawn takes pawn, you're correct. Right? And actually, black didn't want to go down a pawn, so he took, and we'll get back to that in just a second. But here's the variation that the Count and the Duke should have gone into. Variation. Takes. And actually, this bishop has to retreat. Otherwise, you lose a piece or you lose that. And quite simply, white has a fairly free game and can develop however he chooses. Probably knight c3, bishop e3, bishop e2, castles long. Probably bishop e3 and castles long first. But the point is that white's doing very well here. Up a pawn, lead in development, safer king. Right? Instead, Count and the Duke didn't want to be down a pawn. So, they took. And, of course, Morphy takes with the queen and makes a very important threat with bishop to c4. Now, a lot of people will know this as a scholar's mate of sorts. But the thing is, unlike normal scholar's mate setups for white, there's actually a good reason for this. The queen was already on f3. Unlike a lot of cases where white plays e4 and then queen h5. You know, white didn't force this position. Bishop c4 is the most natural square for the piece, and it doesn't give black much opportunity to counter it. Say if he played bishop b5 check, c6, and then bishop c4, well, okay, we're still going to play what he did, except black now got in c6 without wasting a tempo. In addition, the queen on f3 isn't interfering with white's further development of his pieces, which is what you want to do. And of course, white does have a lead in development, is probably up enough to, be the, and is up enough to where white's the one who's going to have the winning chances, right? Also, the queen here has access to a lot of squares along the third rank, and that's going to be very useful. Count and the Duke defended with knight f6, which is the correct way to defend, and queen b3 actually threatens mate, and at the moment bishop b4 is actually bishop b4 is not an option. I'm thinking of the wrong move. I'm thinking eventually queen b4. Queen b4 to try and force the trade of queens is not an option right now. Now, obviously, if black were to try and, say, defend this b6 pawn, we've got mate, so instead the Count and Duke played queen e7. Now, let's go back and say black tried to defend. Well, quite simply, check and mate. And if you go to d7, it's actually still mate. Right? And queen e7. Now, white actually can't take this pawn for the simple reason, and that's actually why he played knight here. White can't take that pawn, and I'll show you why. Because even though it is on paper, it looks like it's winning a pawn, it isn't. Because after queen here, check, here, actually, white does win a pawn, but it's not so clear. Probably f3. And, okay, the game is going to go on, but Morphy didn't like that variation. Because at the end of the day, he was there to go to the opera and actually watch the opera. He wasn't too interested in playing a long, drawn-out game of chess. So after knight c3, black can't play queen b4, and after white's next move, after black's move, I'll show you why. Now, c6 was actually done to prevent both knight d5 and knight b5. It's actually a decent move, so I'm not going to be too critical of it. But let's say black had played queen b4 to try and trade the queens, which is what black maybe wants to do. Problem is we fall victim to some similar checkmates to before. And actually, I believe we go here. No, we don't. Sorry about that. Forgot about the knight. At the very least, we can pin that. And sure, we're going to be losing queen. We can actually throw in this intermediate move of check and force the king there. That actually appears to be checkmate. Interesting. Well, it isn't, but we can drop our bishop back, and we're actually threatening some dangerous stuff here. So at the end of the day, I would say white has an advantage. Up a pawn and with a significantly better position. So that's one of the reasons why the Count and the Duke didn't do that, because at the end of the day, it is bad. So c6. White says, okay, develop. And notice how Morphy is developing a new piece or making a serious threat with each move. Again, similar variations, the only minor, similar variations. Count and the Duke decided, let's get development. And Morphy said, well, the d file is great for my rooks. So how do I get a rook to the d file as quickly as possible? Actually, I think I got the move order wrong. Was it here? Yeah, it was here. I got the move order wrong. Sorry about that. I'm going to overwrite that. b5. And that really serves the needs of the position. It doesn't in the slightest. And honestly, you gotta wonder why this move was played. Because, well, Black's development is pretty bad. Black's king is not going to be safe after this move, and you're just allowing White's pieces to get very active. Now, what the Count and the Duke were probably expecting was maybe bishop to e2 or bishop to d3, or maybe even takes and then bishop back, but they probably weren't expecting what Morphy played. And it's a fairly intuitive move, but it is important because it's a very forcing move and a forcing continuation. And I've dilly-dallied a little bit too long. If you guessed here, you're correct. At the very least, it wins a pawn, because after queen b4, White simply plays knight c3, and the trade of the queens doesn't really do anything other than the fact that White has won a pawn, and Black has a very weak, isolated c-pawn. You could also say it's backwards, too. A backwards, isolated c-pawn. So, plus, this is the 1800s, so of course they took. And after check, knight here, Morphy decided, okay, well, how do I bring more pieces into my attack? Because I have an attack now. Because I have greater development, I have better king safety, and Black's pieces are all tied in or pinned and not defending each other effectively. And he castled, because this is the fastest way to get a rook to the d file, right? Obviously, White is starting to play bishop takes knight, and there's a ton of nasty discoveries and potentially even forced mates, so Black defended. Now, there's a certain rule that you have to follow in the game, and it's a bit of a joke, but there's a certain rule, and this is a move that is actually surprisingly useful and surprisingly good in about 90% of situations. And that move is, well, here's a way to find the move that Morphy played if you have not seen this game before. And the best way to do that is first find your find an undeveloped piece. And the only undeveloped piece is this rook on h1. Well, what would be the absolute best square for it given black's position? Well, you'd want it on the d file, right? Because the d file is the only open file. So the next thing you have to consider is, well, what's the fastest way to get it to the d file? Now, you could say rook d2, and you would almost certainly be correct because it allows you to put it there the next move. However, you also want to be as forcing as possible. Because if you give black the chance, he's going to play g6, bishop g7, and castles. So the correct move is something that won't let him play g6. Or won't let him play queen b4, trying to trade off the ladies. So that really limits what you can do. And the way you calculate is first calculate checks. Well, we only have one check available, and that's bishop takes knight. Well, rook takes bishop, and okay, the next move you'd have to calculate is rook takes rook, queen takes rook, rook here, and okay, you have an edge, but you've kind of traded off all of your attacking pieces and loosened up black's position so that he's escaping. Here you've got black on the ropes, you've got his king trapped in the center, so the best thing you can do is keep all of his pieces tied down. And this bishop is tying down any piece that's on the d7 square. So therefore, you want this bishop still there. So the correct move is, of course, to sacrifice the exchange. Rook takes knight. Obviously, this loses the queen. This was played in game. Queen obviously loses the queen. So rook takes rook. And congratulations, you're completely developed and black is still tied down. And black could probably try to play, this rook is going to get taken next move. So black decides he wants to allow this knight to defend the rook, which is perfectly reasonable. And there are a few squares you can put the queen on that would do it. Queen b4 comes to mind immediately, but, I mean, that still loses. Because I believe similar reasons to what happened in the game. If I remember correctly, all the side variations. But the Count and the Duke chose queen to e6, and this allows a beautiful combination. And again, remember, calculate your checks, calculate everything. But the other thing is you want to visualize the position in a specific way. Imagine black's just kind of these squares, just kind of imagine these squares right here that I'm kind of circling. If we got rid of this rook and this knight, just took them off the board or moved them to where they weren't any threat, well, we'd love for our rook to be here with the bishop on g5 protecting it, because that would be checkmate. So we need to solve how do we get to that checkmate, and it's actually possible here. And you have to calculate with that being your end goal. You have to find a way to distract this rook and this knight. Well, the easiest way to distract the rook is to get rid of it. So if you take, I'm assuming knight takes would be the best move, because I don't think black wants to give up the queen. So after bishop takes rook, knight takes rook, well, we've got the knight out of the way, and the d file is still blocked, but it's fairly easy to actually get the rook to d8 at that point. And, well, if you've solved it here and you've never seen the game before, congrats to you. And if you're still curious about it, well, I'll go ahead and show you now, because it's easy to find the key move of the position once you've properly visualized the position after bishop takes rook, bishop takes d7, and knight takes d7. Because once you get to that point, it's fairly easy to see how you distract the knight and get the knight away off of the d file, so you can play rook d8 mate. Right? Of course, takes, which is the game move here, and the key move is here. Because the only legal move is to take the queen, and now you put your rook on d8, and that is checkmate. Now let's say black had chosen, I believe, queen to b4. A variation. I think this still falls for different reasons. You want to take it to check, so you have to defend. I would assume here. And actually, this might be more threatening. Queen to h3. Because it's really surprisingly difficult. We're threatening checkmate, for one. At the very least, we're also threatening to win material. But maybe that's not the best move. Maybe that's not the best move. Because, I mean, white is down a piece in this position, so I will say it is kind of tough to truly suggest that correct move. Yeah, that's correct. We're threatening 2 checkmates with this move. Overright. Yeah, queen d5. We've got 2 checkmates threatened. And it's somewhat difficult to solve them both. Because the only move that I can see that actually prevents both queen to a8 and queen takes knight mate, because this actually doesn't stop it in the slightest from what I can tell. Because we still take the knight with check, and then we play queen d8, right? Which, okay, so for those who aren't seeing it fully, I'll go ahead and put the moves on the board. The first move that I saw that tried to solve both of those issues was here. And that actually fails to the spectacularly beautiful queen e5. And, of course, calculate accepting first, and that would be checkmate, right? This is the only other defense. And we would take, and that's also checkmate. In this position, assuming another move that I looked at was here, queen b7, bishop e7, we take, king is forced to go there, and then we still play here, because guess what? Checkmate. This is also mating, but it's, again, but I don't like it because it's not as amazing. You know, I believe in going for style points. After queen d5, I believe you could no. Yeah, those are the only moves only 2 moves I can see that actually stop both of the next moves from being checkmate, and they still fail. So, there we go. Anyway, I want to thank everyone for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this look at the opera game and some of the lines from it, and how to actually calculate. And I've got a few games planned for this, including a game that I'm going to actually pair with another game, and explain why it's actually important to know these games, because a lot of these tactical themes do come up all the time in chess. So, should be a fun series, and hope you all enjoyed. See you next time.